Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us this morning or this evening if you're in Japan or Asia. I'm Michael Green. I'm Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS and a professor at Georgetown. And I'm very pleased to be hosting the fifth in a series of Armitage Nye reports, co-chaired by Rich Armitage, Joe Nye, and authored by a group of experts and scholars on Asian security, economics, Japan, and foreign policy. We are going to hear from all of the authors shortly. You can participate in our discussion as well. If you want to submit a question, you can do that through the event page on our website at CSIS, www.csis.org. This report and this event were made possible through internal funding at CSIS. And Rich and Joe and I and the other panelists want to thank Nick Cheney and Eri Hirano and Hannah Fodale at CSIS for their help pulling together the report in today's program, and Lisa Bonner at Armitage International. This is, as I said, the fifth of the Armitage Nye reports, and the history of these reports over the last 2 decades, in many ways, is really a history of the strengthening of the US-Japan alliance in the 21st century. The first report was issued almost exactly 20 years ago today, and was titled "The United States and Japan Advancing Toward a Mature Partnership." After the so-called lost decade of the 1990s, a period that had followed intense US-Japan economic friction in which more Americans and Poles said they feared Japan than the Soviet Union, a period of alliance drift, the bilateral security relationship headed in a new and more positive direction under the leadership of Joe Nye and others at the Pentagon and the Clinton administration. And Ambassador Armitage and Dr. Nye pulled together a group of us to put forward a bipartisan blueprint to keep this work going, no matter who won in the 2000 election. The core argument at the time was that the US-Japan alliance was central to US security strategy in Asia and globally for governance, and had to be at the core of our thinking, and made recommendations in 6 areas: in politics, security, intelligence, economic relations, diplomacy, and US bases in Okinawa and across Japan. In the Bush administration, in which Rich and I served, this became, not just figuratively, but literally the blueprint for our Asia policy and our Japan strategy. The second report in 2007 was called "The US-Japan Alliance Getting Asia Right Through 2020." And the premise was fairly straightforward, that at a time of Chinese ambitions and uncertainty about China's future role, it was necessary for the US to get Asia right if we were going to have any purchase on this challenge of a re-rising China. And getting Asia right had to begin with Japan. In 2012, the third report, US-Japan Alliance Anchoring Stability in Asia, focused on locking in the alliance for the future after a period of some uncertainty with a new government in Japan, ultimately resulting in bipartisan support on both sides of the Pacific for the alliance. But time, we felt, to lock in the alliance on a positive trajectory going forward. And that report asked the rather provocative question, is Japan going to remain a tier 1 country in international affairs? And it prompted Prime Minister Abe, in his first speech in the United States in 2013, to answer us by declaring that Japan is not now and will never be a tier 2 country. The fourth report in 2018, the US-Japan Alliance More Important Than Ever, addressed some of the cracks in the alliance that were beginning to show with a transactional president, but also trying to put some support behind aspects of a maritime strategy and Indo-Pacific strategy that was aligning both Tokyo and Washington in a more challenging environment. This report, the fifth, is called "The US-Japan Alliance Equal Partners with a Global Agenda." And it marks both the successful conclusion of Prime Minister Abe's unprecedented lengthy term as Prime Minister, but also comes at a time of changing leadership in both countries, and a time when Japan is stepping in and stepping up during a US period of uncertainty in regional and global leadership. And so we're going to hear from the co-chairs and then from the authors, but let me begin first by introducing the two co-chairs of our report. Richard Armitage served as Deputy Secretary of State and Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. He was Deputy Secretary in the Bush administration, Assistant Secretary in the Reagan administration. He's the founding partner and president of Armitage International. And Dr. Joseph Nye was chair of the National Intelligence Council and Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs in the Clinton administration, and Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus now at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. So to introduce the fifth Armitage and I report, let me turn it over to Ambassador Rich Armitage.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Green. To our friends in Washington, good morning. To our friends in Tokyo, good evening. To all those friends in between, good day. I'm very grateful to all of our colleagues, who Mike will introduce shortly, for participating in this fifth report. Now, in truth, Dr. Nye and I thought we'd retired from Armitage Nye reports, but a couple of things intervened. First of all, we've had, as Mike indicated, new administrations, both here in Washington and recently in Tokyo. And second, I think the regional and the world order is now under more stress than it's been at any time in the last 70 years. Now, notwithstanding the difficulty of governance in Washington, there is some really good news. And I think the really good news is the US-Japan alliance is supported in a very broad and very wide bipartisan fashion. The very title of this report, An Equal Alliance with a Global Agenda, in a way tells us all we need to know. It's a recognition, as Mike has indicated, of Japan's role in the relative absence of the United States from world leadership. And it's a recognition of both Mr. Abe and the expectation of Mr. Suga continuing in a very real way to be leaders in the free world. And second, it's quite clear that our alliance is moving from interoperability to interdependence, where we're together will simultaneously be dealing with crises as well as longer term challenges, climate change, etc. But one thing I'd like to make crystal clear, there's a lot of discussion, and you'll hear some today about the host nation support or burden sharing, but I want to be very clear, crystal clear on this. For those of us who authored this report, for those who serve with great distinction in our great bureaucracies, and I think I'm speaking for those in the Gaima show and the Bowie show as well, our alliance is not a burden. Our alliance is a sacred trust. It's a trust that we give to Japan and we receive from Japan. So with that, I'd like to turn over to my partner in crime and good friend, Dr. Joe Nye, for the opening remarks you'd like to make, Joe.
Some 20 years ago, sorry, I have to mute come. When you and I first started these 20 years ago, we were worried about the future of the alliance. And at that stage, there was a feeling that it wasn't properly appreciated, but we gradually saw a bipartisan consensus behind it. And in that sense, as you said, the title of our fifth report says it all. It's now an equal alliance with a global agenda. It's true that we were still strongly in favor of the alliance in those days. Even before our first report, Ambassador Mike Mansfield had said that there's no more important alliance in the world, bar none, and we continued to adhere to that. But the difference is at that stage, you could argue that American pressure and Gaiatsu was an important part of the alliance. Well, that's not true anymore. If you look at the initiatives that Japan has been taking in the last several years, this is now, as the title says, an equal alliance with a global agenda. And the reason that it's so important is when the US and Japan work together, we can shape the environment in which Chinese power increases and in which the threat to from North Korea continues. So working closely together is absolutely essential for peace and prosperity in East Asia and in the world. In that sense, if you look at Japan's defense budget, which is now larger than Britain's, and if you look at the growing closeness of US and Japanese military cooperation, we really can shape the environment in East Asia. But we're pointing out in this report that our alliance is going well beyond the military. And you'll hear from each of the different authors about this, of how the pieces fit together. But many of the new challenges that we face are economic and technological. And there, I think the important thing is if you look at the lead that Japan has taken on many areas in trade and in technology and in economic assistance to infrastructure to counter the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, you'll see that Japanese leadership is crucial. Similarly, when we look at the technological problems that are rising from fifth generation of telecommunications or artificial intelligence, you'll notice also that the ability to work together on setting standards is going to be crucial, and Japan has an amazingly important role to play in that. And finally, there's the whole area of climate and the question of how are we going to cope with the emerging problems of climate, where Japan's pledge to become carbon neutral by mid-century is of extraordinary importance, and another area where we're going to see closer technological cooperation between the US and Japan. So to go back to your opening point, an equal alliance with a global agenda, yes, this has always been the most important alliance, bar none, but now it is a much broader and more equal alliance, and with an agenda which really is centered in East Asia, but really is global. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Joe. We have questions coming in already, and in keeping with the title of this year's report on a global agenda, we have questions not only from Tokyo and Kyoto and Washington, New York, and San Francisco and Hawaii, as you'd expect, but we also have questions from Krakow, from Paris, and from Budapest. And we still have room for questions if you'd like to send them. I'm going to turn over the discussion now to the panelists who helped write the report. First, we'll hear from Kara Bu, who is a former State Department official and one of the founding partners of Armitage International. Sheila Smith, a senior fellow for Japan Studies at Council on Foreign Relations. Then Zack Cooper, research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Matt Goodman, senior vice president for economics and Simon Chair at CSIS, and Bob Manning, a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And then I'll wrap up with some comments after hearing from my colleagues. But let me turn it over now to Kara to give you more of the details of the report and our recommendations.
Thanks, Mike. And given the global reach of this event, I'd like to say good morning, good day, and good evening to everyone. In the report, you'll see where we've bolded some language, and those are some recommendations we wanted to be sure we highlighted. One part of the report, which isn't bolded in language, but is critical to us talking about an equal alliance, however, are former Prime Minister Abe's contributions to the US-Japan alliance, and really to Japan's leadership role, both regionally and globally. Faced with an increasingly harsh security environment and unequal a leadership role from the United States in recent years, it was Prime Minister Abe who took up the mantle and not only led the alliance forward, but also regional security. So some of the things we highlight are the long overdue reinterpretation of Article 9, which allowed for increased security cooperation, both with the US and others, his work on the CPTPP, which he led to completion, and then also his vision for the Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific, which obviously spurred our own thinking in terms of how to approach the region. So these are very important things that he did. And what we're hoping is that with these great strides in hand, Prime Minister Suga can continue Japan's leadership role on these issues. And last Friday, he made some public comments where he spoke about the importance of the US-Japan alliance, and those were very welcome on both sides. So we hope that Prime Minister Suga, as a result, will be among the first to visit President Joe Biden when he assumes office in January, to continue what has been an incredible run for the US-Japan alliance, allowing for this equality that now exists. So with that, I'll hand it over to Sheila.
Thank you, Clara. I'm delighted to be here this morning with my distinguished colleagues. It's an important moment to take stock of where the US-Japan relationship is. The alliance at the moment is not one where one power is catching up with the other. It's really a moment where we are sharing power, not only to enhance our own partnership in our alliance, but also to build regional cooperation across the Indo-Pacific and to integrate regional and global economies. It is, as previous speakers had said, this is an equal alliance with a global reach. I think it's also important to realize that the partnership needs to have a strategic vision. We can't just go on automatic pilot. And I think it's important that we actively focus on what that strategic vision should be. We need to leverage our partnership. And this is not just a matter of dollars or yen. It is a measure of how we want to shape the region and how we want to shape the world that we all live in today. A world, as others have said, is increasingly unpredictable. The United States and Japan need to reset our alliance conversation. And this is a good moment to do it. And those of us who gathered for this report, following the lead of Mr. Armitage and Dr. Nye, this is what we focused on. And I want to specifically here note that our host nation support agreement, which is due to be negotiated and is up for renegotiation next year, needs to be part of our conversation, but it cannot be the sole focus of our conversation. We need to conclude it as soon as possible. It's important, but it is not the strategic vision that I think we are all looking for. So operationalizing our strategic cooperation, that's what we should be doing. Again, we should do it bilaterally for the alliance, but we should also do it as we look out across the region that is changing so rapidly. And this should be the focus of the new administration coming in and the focus of the United States' attention. Thank you all very much.
I'll jump in. Thanks, Sheila. I'll jump in with some additional exposition on this idea of power sharing rather than burden sharing, which Sheila touched on. So we often talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and the fact that that concept actually came from Tokyo and was imported by Washington. It's not just because those words sounded good to the Trump administration. It's actually for some more fundamental reasons. And I think part of what we try and highlight in the report is the fact that the United States and Japan share interests across all of the major domains of the competition with China. So let me just walk through them briefly. So in the strategic domain, the US and Japan obviously have a shared alliance. We have military challenges that we approach together, but it's deeper than that. Our concerns about Chinese strategic objectives abroad are bigger than just our military concerns. And that's one really critical aspect of the alliance. But the alliance doesn't stop there. If you look at the economic domain, the US and Japan also have shared interests. We worry about unfair state subsidies. We worry about technology theft. And we worry about trying to make sure that our technological lead and our economic advancement are able to continue despite pressure from Beijing. In the technology area, again, we have two highly advanced economies. We share a lot of technology interests. We both worry about the future of the free and open internet, not just the free and open Indo-Pacific. And then finally, on the democratic governance area, we are two of the leading democracies in the world and have sought consistently to try and expand and strengthen democracies worldwide. And so in each of these areas, the US and Japan have shared interests. across the strategic, economic, technological, and governance domains. And I think one thing that is absolutely critical is to note that it's not just that the US and Japan have critically aligned interests in these areas, it's that we're only potentially the two only countries that share almost the exact same interests in all of these areas. There are other countries that are absolutely critical to 3 of these categories or that play a large part in all of them, but the US and Japan are more aligned on these 4, I think, than any other countries in the world. And that makes the alliance absolutely critical for both of us. And it's part of why the US was able to import Japan's strategy, the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, into US strategy and strategic thinking. And I think one of the absolutely critical elements, therefore, going ahead is for us to see Japan as a critical partner in thinking about how we prioritize across these domains. So it's not enough for us just to rely on Japan as a more equal partner in the military domain. We also need Japan to help the United States think through its strategy across all of these areas. And that's one thing the report really highlights. So why don't I hand it over to Matt Goodman for a couple more words on the economic side of the alliance.
Thanks very much, Zach. Good morning, good day, good evening to everyone. Delighted to be with you. I'll just make 4 quick points about the economic part of the report. First, economics is at the heart of the alliance. Article 2, not Article 22, Article 2 of the alliance calls for us to set aside our economic conflicts and work together to collaborate on economic issues. And the real challenge today is working together to establish economic rules, standards, norms, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but globally. And as Zach just said, we're almost entirely aligned with Japan on those issues. And so there's a huge opportunity. The second point is we call for the United States to join the comprehensive and progressive TPP, a Trans-Pacific Partnership. We know that's a controversial recommendation, but we believe that's important, critical to US national interests. We note Japan's efforts to keep TPP alive after the United States withdrew from it in 2017. And Japan also kept the door open, importantly, to US return. Obviously, if a Biden administration were to decide to rejoin TPP, it would want some changes. And I think we feel that the other partners would be willing to accommodate some of those changes. We understand this is politically difficult in the United States and believe that the US would have to do things in parallel with joining an agreement like this at home. But we still think strategically this is critical to our position and the credibility of our commitment to the region. A third point is that the US and Japan should be working together on digital governance. So whether you agree with the somewhat trite phrase, data is the new oil or not, everybody knows data is important. And I think people recognize that the internet right now is at risk of being split into at least 3, if not more pieces, and that's suboptimal for a number of reasons. So there's a lot to build on in the area of digital and data governance in the Indo-Pacific region. You've got TPP itself, which has disciplines. Those were strengthened in the US Mexico-Canada agreement, which is an Indo-Pacific agreement, by the way, in case that was in doubt. And in the US-Japan bilateral digital trade agreement, there are also further disciplines there. So all of this can be built on. Japan, again, has been a leader in this area. Last year, as host of the G20 in Osaka, Japan got endorsement of this concept of data free flow with trust. That could be built on and made more specific in specific rules, standards, norms. So that's an important area, we feel. Final point is on infrastructure and economic development, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. Joe Nye mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, China's ambitious plan to build infrastructure across the world and even into outer space. This initiative is bogged down right now for a lot of reasons. We think that's an opportunity for the United States and Japan to step in and provide its own form of support for infrastructure development just in the Indo-Pacific region alone. There's a need of about 25 trillion, that's trillion with a T, of infrastructure over the next 10 years or so. So we specifically call for the new U.S. International Development Finance Corporation to partner with JBIC and other organizations in the region to help build infrastructure. And finally, we suggest the two governments should be working together, as they've done in the past, to provide development assistance around the region, particularly in Southeast Asia, for capacity building and improving governance and accountability. Those are real strengths that we can bring to the table. Final point, just to note that on the three substantive points I made, CPTPP, data, and infrastructure, Japan has been a leader over the last few years in advancing rules and norms, and it's time for the US and Japan to join hands and do that together. So over to Bob. I think you're muted, Bob.
Sorry about that. Greetings, everyone. What I want to do is focus on technology. The world is in the midst of what's often called the fourth industrial revolution, and we've seen it from AI to new materials to miracle vaccines in 9 months and so on. And this is going to shape growth in the world over the next 2 decades, and will also shape the hierarchy of national power. So this is a critical area. And in terms of Indo-Pacific strategy, without the economic component, trade and technology, any Indo-Pacific strategy will be hollow, and particularly given the continued populist nationalism in the United States, I would say unsustainable. So this is a critical area. Japan is the 4th largest economy in the world, is a tech innovator in many respects. And I think there's a good fit between, and we also have China, of course, now coming up with China Standards 2035, which is an attempt to shape the future of technological standards, and which will govern the use of all these applications according to Chinese needs. So I think it's imperative that the US and Japan, the core, and reaching out to Europe and Australia and other like-minded countries can form a common approach to, in standard settings bodies, the Chinese have an army of subsidized actors going in, and I think the US has been remiss, and we need to step up our game on that. One critical area I want to talk about is 5G and the Internet of Things. Rakuten, a Japanese firm, has been in the lead in developing this open radio access network, which is interoperable and would allow people not to have to depend on Huawei hardware. So and there's a huge effort going on in the private sector to operationalize and scale this up. I think that's a critical area where the US and Japan can really play a leadership role. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about energy, where also we're seeing emerging technologies. Although everybody talks about electric cars, hydrogen is surging. Japan has been a leader in hydrogen cars. So it's not just oil and gas, it's hydrogen, it's carbon sequestration. If there's any hope of clean coal, that's it. How can we commercialize this? And then you also have energy storage, which is absolutely critical to scaling up renewable energy and electric transport. And I think there combined efforts to, I don't want to use the term Marshall Plan or anything like that, but a accelerated effort to have breakthroughs so to lower the cost and the efficiency of energy storage will be critical both to climate change and to economic prosperity. And I think with that, I'll stop and turn it back to Mike.
Thank you, everyone. Let me end before we go to Q&A with 2 other points from our report. One I will explain on behalf of Victor Cha, one of our co-authors who was pulled away this morning and wasn't able to join us. And he was going to speak about a part of the report that actually has been prominent in our writing over the last few reports, and that's the US-Japan ROK trilateral relationship. One of the most important features of our alliance over the last decade has been the external networking with Australia in particular, but also with India through the Quad. But decades ago, the most important networking of the U.S.-Japan alliance was identified as the U.S.-Japan ROK security relationship. First and foremost, because it enhances deterrence on the Korean Peninsula. It would be extremely difficult for either the U.S. ROK or the U.S.-Japan alliance to function efficiently without connectivity between those two bilateral alliances. But not only in a contingency in the diplomatic process, as Victor Chan, I know, and Ambassador Armitage and others from negotiations with North Korea, when the US, ROK, and Japan are in lockstep, we have far more leverage, far more purchase in the negotiating process than when we are at odds. But now in the broader context of shifting power relationships in the region, Korea has a critical role to play in preserving a free and open Indo-Pacific, a rules-based region that locks US alliances in, but is inviting and inclusive for those who play by the rules. And in both areas, vis-a-vis North Korea and in the broader Indo-Pacific context, Japan and Korea are not at their best right now. And we debated this quite a bit. How can the US play a role? And there were some questions in the chat, so we might get to this more. But essentially, we argued that the focus really needs to be on the future, not the past. Seoul and Tokyo each have a role to play. There are some hints of incremental progress. And the US role is really to keep us focused on the trilateral security cooperation needed to deal with these two challenges, the acute and immediate threat from North Korea and the larger geopolitical challenge of creating an Indo-Pacific where we're able to work with China constructively and there isn't revisionism. So we can come back to that in the Q&A, and I'm sorry Dr. Cha couldn't join us. The second issue, which I was asked to talk about from the report, has to do with the changing roles, missions, and capabilities in the alliance. Japan's military budget is about 50 billion a year. It puts them in a league with Britain and France, and critical to deterrence and stability in the region. But there are some big questions coming up about roles, missions, and capabilities, and in particular, how Japan will pursue counterstrike capability and missile defense. And we argued both are critical for the alliance. We need a forthright discussion that needs to not only be in government, but in Parliament and the Congress and among experts and the public. Underpinning all of this shifting thinking about roles and missions and capabilities, which is in response to the challenges we face, underpinning all of it should be a renewed attention on command and control. And we argue in the report that the US and Japan really have to move expeditiously to address some of the anachronisms really in our command and control relationships. As everyone on this call will know, this is not an alliance that has a joint and combined command structure like US, Korea, or NATO. And boy, are we paying a price for that right now. It creates gaps and inefficiencies in everything from training to defining requirements for our equipment and intelligence sharing. And we push in this report for a more serious look at how to strengthen command and control relationships, perhaps not exactly like Korea or exactly like NATO, but stepping up from where we are. So there's more in the report, and there's more that can be said about the US-Japan alliance in Asia and even Europe and Asia than we have in the report. So I'm going to turn now to the questions. And they're great questions, and you can keep them coming. If I can direct the first one to Rich and the second one to Joe, but the floor will be open for others on the panel. Rich, Keiichiro Masuda in Tokyo asked about Article 9 of the Constitution. Is it not still a major obstacle to Japan stepping up for an equal alliance?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for the question. The reinterpretation of Article 9 has removed the obstacle from my point of view. We are now able to plan together without the interruptions of somebody or other fearing that we were violating the precepts of Article 9. Second, it would take a particular amount of political energy to get rid of the Article 9 prohibition completely. And the question is, do we have the time, do we have the energy, or are there other things now that are more important for us to jointly approach. So thank you for the question, but it is no longer the issue that it once was.
Sheila, let me ask you, you follow Japanese domestic politics closely. Is it an issue? Is it realistic? Is it necessary?
Thank you, Mike. I agree with Rich. I think Article 9 is a political question for the Japanese people, and it is not necessarily a policy question, right, for as we think about the alliance. But I will say, as you look at the extent to which the United States and Japan over the years and have transformed their relationship of security cooperation, and including right up to that reinterpretation of Article 9 that Ambassador Armitage referenced, I think we see that the alliance actually has had significant policy change even within the confines of Article 9. And so I think it's important for the conversation in Japan to evolve as it does in a tempered way that has the support of the Japanese people. This alliance doesn't move forward without the support of both the Japanese and American people. But I don't think at the policy level today we have differences or policy priorities that cannot be resolved, given that the Article 9 still exists as it does.
So Joe, I'm going to turn to you to answer that one, but also there's a question for you specifically from Matake Kameya in Japan. And he asks if you could tell us, we have a lot of recommendations in the report. It's the 5th report. But from your perspective, Joe, what's the singular thing Japan could really do right now to define itself as an equal partner in this alliance?
Well, I think Japan is already doing it. What we don't pay enough attention to and give Japan enough credit for is the role that it is playing in developing informal networks in the region. In other words, if you look at China's efforts in the Belt and Road Initiative to woo and pay different countries, the fact that Japan has been working since 2015 with developing an open infrastructure capacity where standards and accountability are open, and that this includes not only the larger countries in Southeast Asia, but the smaller islands in the South Pacific, where China has been making a major effort to essentially purchase their loyalty. That role, which is JICA and JBIC and smart diplomacy, is actually quite crucial, particularly over the last 3 or 4 years when the U.S. has not been as active or present as we should be. So I would focus on if you want, Japan's quiet and soft power. Obviously, Japan's military capacities working closely together in the military area is crucial. I want people to spend more time realizing how much Japan has been doing quietly and how crucial that is.
It's what some scholars are calling Japan's network power,
Yes.
The ability to create networks, because with the notable and important exception of Korea, in most of Asia, Japan enjoys over 90% favorability ratings and is able to connect better than the US, better than Australia, certainly better than China or Russia. I have a lot of questions, interestingly, about the Quad. So former PACON Commander Tim Keating asked if more can be done to leverage this quadrilateral relationship, US, Japan, India, Australia. Kenji Sawada asked if maybe it's time to bring Korea into the Quad. And there are other questions about the future of the Quad. So I'm going to start, if I could, with Zack, and then go to Kara and Bob, but everyone can weigh in on this one. It's a big issue. When you talk about networking, that is sort of the next big thing. So Zack, why don't you start us off on the future of the Quad?
Thanks, Mike. It's a great question. And I think this is an area where some of us may actually have some different views. So I'll just give you my personal view, which is that I think the progress on the Quad has been incredibly important. The Quad is now, I think, increasingly the go-to strategic coalition, I would say, in Asia, right? It includes 3 of the key US allies and partners in the region, and that's incredibly important. But I actually think with the incoming Biden team, the Quad is probably not going to be quite as important as it has been for the Trump administration. And here's why. Often the Trump administration put a lot of effort into the Quad and probably in the view of many, downgraded ASEAN, downgraded some of the other US relationships in the region at their expense. And so I think the challenge now for the Biden team is how do you keep this momentum going on the Quad while still investing more time and energy into some relationships that frankly are in worse shape than they used to be. The US relationship with ASEAN and with the member states themselves, the US relationship with Korea. And I think there's going to be a real challenge in trying to invest time and energy into all of these things at the same time. So I think the Quad has been incredibly important, but actually, in my view, one thing that will be really critical for the Quad and for all 4 countries individually is to help the US pivot back to Southeast Asia. And so the Quad has a lot that it can bring to Southeast Asia, right? We've done infrastructure investment there. We're doing lots of security work. But I think helping the US sort of re-enter Southeast Asia in a valuable long-term way where we see the virtues of that, of the Southeast Asian relationships that we have, that's going to be incredibly important from the Quad in the next couple of years, I think.
All right.
Well, it's always hard to disagree with Zack, so I won't. But what I do think, he spoke earlier about all the different domains in which we're going to have to compete going forward. And I think that's going to place a premium on the US being very nimble in this part of the world. And so while the Quad does form an important part of our engagement there, I think we will need to look to other networks as well. And so therefore, again, we're going to have to be very nimble and focused.
Bob?
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that's been said. I just like to put it in a larger framework because we have all these overlapping and not very functional institutions in Asia, the ARF, the EAS, and so on. And I think that it's not completely obvious to me what the purpose of the Quad is beyond military and strategic coordination, maritime coordination. And so we need to think through how these pieces fit together, because on things like technology, Korea is a very important player. And so I think you need to, the way I would think about it is more of a variable geometry, that different players bring different things to the table on different issues. And when we're fashioning priorities in diplomacy, we need to think through who needs to be at the table on what issues and so on. So I would put the Quad in that larger context.
I don't know if others want to weigh in. Go ahead. I am a fan of the Quad myself, but with the caveat or with the context that Bob just mentioned, the very variable geometry, the eclectic nature of institution building in Asia, there is no one size. If there's a one size fits all institution in Asia, it's the US-Japan alliance. That's about it. Otherwise, we're patching together, organizations, meetings, forums, summits that work sometimes they don't. Everyone who spoke earlier is right. We've stepped away a bit from ASEAN, but we also have to be realistic. The last time ASEAN had a major role in shaping the environment was before 2016, when China broke the consensus in ASEAN, got Cambodia to boycott ASEAN's role in the aftermath of the Philippines' successful case against China in the International Tribunal under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So multilateralism in Southeast Asia broke a bit. It wasn't just that the Trump administration pulled back. And I think everyone on the panel agrees that the Biden administration is going to have to step up significantly our diplomatic engagement and economic engagement and capacity building with Southeast Asia. I think the Quad complements and supplements that. Engagement with Southeast Asia is not a balance of power strategy. It does not dissuade and deter China. The Quad notionally, conceptually can do that, because when you combine these 4 navies, as we did in 2005 for tsunami relief, that's a very powerful asset on the chessboard in Asia. The Royal Australian Navy, the US Navy, India, and Japan. But that's still partly notional. This is partly about signaling and demonstrating the consequences of Chinese coercion. And will the Biden administration be less serious about the Quad? It maybe there's a little less enthusiasm for it among some than there was with Trump. But I would argue the one and only meeting of the Quad foreign ministers that just occurred was because of India. It was an Indian demand signal. And I think if India and Japan, Australia say we want to do this, I am absolutely sure the Biden administration will step up and do it. It takes 4 to tango in this case. Sheila or others, did you want to weigh in on the Quad?
Just a quick comment, Mike, if you don't mind. I think the point where you left off is really something I wanted to emphasize, and that is the Quad is 4 different partners, right? And there are us and 3 others, and they too have their different geography, their different desires for where they want to focus cooperation. So I think I agree with everybody. We need to be flexible and nimble, but I do want to point out that where we start to develop an impression that we're exclusive, in other words, we are not including ASEAN, or we are not, as Bob said, including South Korea. That's, I think we want to temper a little bit the way in which we think about the Quad's role. I think it's one of many instruments, and it's a powerful one, but we need to use it appropriately.
Rich and Joe?
Thank you, Mike. 2 points. I'm in favor of the Quad, not supplanting anything else, certainly not the U.S.-Japan relationship, but the fact that it's got our longtime ally, Australia, and our new ally, India, alongside Japan, I think makes it a factor, number one. Number 2, ASEAN is not going to go away. We paid no attention to it, as my colleagues have more or less indicated. In my view, many of the ASEAN nations have stood up stronger and longer than some of us would have thought. So I think the Biden administration will pay long overdue attention to the nations and the structure of ASEAN. And finally, someone, I think in your initial question, Mike, had mentioned the relationship with the Republic of Korea. Just to underscore something, the United States and relationship with the Republic of Korea right now is quite troubled. And to not acknowledge that, and simply to say that, as we did say, that Japan and Korea ought to look to the future and not to the past, it's a fair comment. It's the reason our windshields in our cars are larger looking forward than they are in the rear view, because you do move forward. But the United States has a lot of work to do, and so does the Republic of Korea, to kind of right the ship of our relationship. Thank you.
Joe?
Just a quick point on the Quad. I think it's extremely important, but we should see it as one of the many networks in East Asia and Asia Pacific and Indo-Pacific, not as an overarching network. In other words, Quad, yes, and we should invest in it, but Quad itself is simply one among a number of important networks.
So we have a lot of questions about how other parts of the world plug into this networking of the alliance and the strategy we're describing, which is encouraging, actually. And I think it reflects, for those of you who have seen the recent CSIS poll on China policy, we surveyed foreign policy thinkers around the world and found a real convergence in Asia, Europe, and North America on issues of security and human rights and trade. So there are a lot of questions along those lines. Alexander Jelosevic in Serbia asks about Europe's role in the free and open Indo-Pacific, whatever we're going to call it going forward. But also importantly, can the US and Japan do something to help in Central and Southeast Europe, where China is starting to do what it has already done in ASEAN, to split apart the EU, to leverage Belt and Road, to try to get some access. I'll let Matt start on that one. In addition, we have questions about, from Henrik Kraft, about Western Europe. The Netherlands, France, other countries are announcing Indo-Pacific strategies that largely align with a strategy first articulated by Japan. You know, how does Europe more broadly, perhaps NATO, play into this strategy? And then we had a question about Canada from a student in Canada. Canada also has an Indo-Pacific strategy and is, you know, at the blunt end of Chinese coercion as much as Japan is, with boycotts, with the arrest of scholars. So let's broaden the team and let's talk about these. I'll start with you, Matt, because I think the Southeast Europe question really points to infrastructure. And we'll go around everyone on this one. the U.S.-Japan Alliance has pointed a strategy out that's attractive to many of our allies and partners around the world. Matt.
No, it's a very good question. And it's interesting that I think the view in Brussels about Europe's posture in Asia, in particular vis-a-vis China, really was altered, began to be altered by what China was doing in Southeastern Europe on this sort of on Europe's or the EU's sort of eastern and southern flank, with particularly this Belt and Road, these Belt and Road investments, and this so-called 16+1, now 17+1, because Greece has joined it, which is 17 Southern and Eastern European countries plus China, a sort of amorphous network, which really concerned Brussels because they saw this was being done in a way that wasn't necessarily consistent with EU rules and standards and norms. So that started a process of kind of really scales falling from eyes in Brussels, and now has spread to other areas where, historically Europe has been interested in Asia mainly, or a little since Dien Bien Phu has been interested in Asia, not because of security or strategic reasons, but for economic and commercial reasons. And it seemed like a one-way bet that you could sell into these big markets over there or invest over there to gain the benefits of global supply chains. I think that thinking that's still there, that impulse, but that's been very much balanced by concerns about Chinese influence in, as I mentioned, Eastern and Southern Europe, by Chinese technology theft and worries about transfers of technology through various means. And so various mechanisms are being built up in Europe. And I think there's a huge opportunity for us here in the US plus Japan to work with Europe on some of those issues, not to try to isolate or contain China, of course, but to find a way to address some of those real concerns while still engaging with China.
I'm going to go to Bob next because Bob has the word Atlantic in his byline. And this has prompted questions, so I'm going to throw into the mix Israel. Someone asked about Israel as well. Feel free to pick any and all countries you want. It's a bit like a game of Risk.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, I think the way I would look at it is, first, we need to give Trump credit, actually, for calling out China on the structural issues. The problem is he turned it into a U.S.-China issue when it should be a China versus the world issue. So that's the framework I would look at it. And in that context, Europe and other like-minded countries are critically important in this kind of backlash we're seeing, the Chinese weaponization of trade and technology and coercion. That's, makes a joke of Xi talking about globalization. And so I think we need, and Europe, of course, defines itself as a kind of regulatory superpower. And I think on the issues that Matt was talking about in terms of the digital future of the internet and on technology, I think the only way we can successfully push back to China is if there's a coalition of forces that have enough weight. And I think Europe, Japan, Asia, and the United States are critical to trying to do that. And that's one thing that's been missing so far. I suspect that the Biden administration is going to that's going to be an animating idea in their policies.
Others on Europe, Joe or Rich? Rich?
Yes, Mike, I, like all of us, I have a past. And in my past, in the Pentagon, I one day received a visiting delegation from parliamentarians from Great Britain. And it was in the early 80s, and the leader of the delegation sat down and he said, "Young man," and I was a much younger man then, he said, "Young man, what's all this nonsense about Asia? For us, it's the backside of the moon." And I responded, "Well, for us, it's the sun. This is our future." And I was frankly a little surprised at the attitude because of Britain and others, the Netherlands and France's colonial past at a minimum in Asia. But look at how much has changed. I think that France and Netherlands and Britain and others right now have recognized that they do have some residual knowledge of Asia, and it can be put to good use this time and not colonial uses. And look at Great Britain, and they have a carrier going into Asia. And this is, I think, a very significant event. For so long, our European friends understandably have been mesmerized by the specter of first the Soviet Union and second the Russian Federation, and particularly their activities in Ukraine, et cetera. But I think now our European friends have raised their head above the parapet, and they're actually looking around and seeing that there are many like-minded countries who want to deal with similar global standards, want to have good governance, want to have an appropriate attention to human rights and human freedoms. And I think the Biden administration can and will harvest this.
Joe.
I think what's fascinating is that, as many of my colleagues have said, Europe has rediscovered China. It hasn't really rediscovered Japan. And yet, if you look at many of the issues that we're talking about, for example, setting standards for 5G, or the whole idea of 6G, of the China's 2035 standard procedures that it's pushing at the International Telecommunications Union, these are things where Japan plays an extraordinarily important role. So yes, Europe has rediscovered China, but it's time for Europe to rediscover Japan and the importance of Japan.
That's a really important point. And to Zach's earlier comment, Japan is the only ally we have who's, this closely aligned with us on all of these key issues in strategic competition with China. And we would have some serious challenges getting a transatlantic agreement on digital trade, for example, because of differences over privacy and antitrust. But I think Canada stands out in this regard. Canada has rediscovered Japan, CPTPP, and perhaps some countries are going to be a little more further along in thinking about the Japan angle than others. Britain might be in that category as well, and probably Israel to some extent. There was a question about Israel, and I think I'll briefly answer that by saying that, as people on this panel know, Netanyahu and Abe developed a quite close relationship, and there were some important, not widely noticed, but important changes in Japanese diplomacy in the Middle East to engage much more with Israel, and particularly on issues of technology and cybersecurity. And I don't see any reason why Prime Minister Suga would change that. It's in Japan's material interests to have a more innovative economy and to catch up on cybersecurity. Bob, did I see your hand up? And anyone else? And then we'll go to the next question.
Make a quick point. People don't appreciate, but Israel is really a global leader in tech innovation, and all the software in self-driving cars is mostly Israeli, and they are per capita, I think, the leading innovator. They punch way above their weight, and I think they can be an important element in dealing with technology with the U.S., Japan, and Europe. So I wouldn't underestimate the importance of Israel in that regard.
So this isn't any of your fault, but CSIS put out another report last week on the U.S. Marine Corps, the future of the U.S. Marine Corps, by my colleague Mark Hansen. It's a really excellent report looking at General Berger's vision for the Marine Corps and what's realistic, what's going to be challenging in terms of budgets and operations and forward presence. And as often happens, one line on page, I don't know what, raised questions about whether the Futenma replacement facility will ever be done. And so I have a gazillion questions about that. And I want to be fair to the questioners and and be very unfair and throw that at Sheila first, since she's lived in Okinawa and had nothing to do with the report. And by the way, it was not a CSIS report. It was a report by Mark Hansen. But as I said, a really I think probably the most in-depth report on the future of the Marine Corps outside of the Marine Corps in some time. But it does raise questions about Futenma, about forward presence. It's an issue we've addressed in most of the Armitage and I reports, so we ought to address it here. Start with Sheila and others who want to step into her defense.
Thank you, Mike. I want to say I didn't even know about that report until the question was raised by Steve Rabson. So I do not, I'm not associated with that report, but I do think what's important here as we think about looking forward and looking ahead and retooling the alliance or adjusting to what's happening in the region is obviously the Japanese government has refocused their force posture to the Southwest. And we've watched that over years now develop in their thinking. And that also puts a particular spotlight on Okinawa and the self-defense force presence there. The second piece, of course, is how our forces work together. And you see specifically for the US Marine Corps piece of it, the contribution that the US Marine Corps has made to helping the ground self-defense forces, for example, develop their amphibious capability. That also has real consequences for how the United States and Japanese forces are positioned inside Japan, but then beyond that. How they train and how they develop their capabilities. So I think I won't speak specifically to Futenma because I can't, I'm not following it as closely as that question would merit. But I do think Okinawa is now in a very different position in terms of Japan's own defense planning and thinking than it was when the original conversation about relocating the US Marine Corps off of that particular base to somewhere else. So I think one of the things looking forward that I would like to see, and again, this is a personal point of view not reflected in the report, is how the United States and Japanese forces can share space, can co-locate, can think about their operational needs in a way that also reduces the American-only real estate that is still in Japan. Because I think the two militaries today would like to see more operational proximity to each other in different bases. And we see that with ballistic missile defenses. We see that with our Navy. There's opportunities here to explore. But I think at the end of the day, this is a long-term, very difficult process of trying to recalibrate the burden in particular communities and move it across in a dispersed way. And our forces have been thinking about this with their Japanese counterparts for some time now.
Joe?
I agree with what Sheila said. I don't know whether the base at Futenma is going to be relocated at Oko or not. That's obviously a question for internal Japanese politics. But I do want to recall that in our fourth Armitage NI report, we argued that we should be addressing a longer term perspective of how the bases are distributed throughout Japan. And we argued that the more that we had a broad distribution in which US forces were sharing bases which had Japanese flags on an operational basis, the better that would be. Misawa, I guess, is a good example of that. But we didn't stress that again in the fifth report, but I thought it was one of the important things in our fourth report that we had to look beyond just the immediate problems of Futenma and Honoko and ask over a longer term, since this US-Japan alliance is going to continue for a very long term, what's the optimal basing strategy? And we thought that we should be doing joint studies between US and Japanese planners on how you would get a structure which would have more US forces operating out of Japanese bases rather than just US bases.
Zack?
That's such an important point. And just to build on that, I think we have to realize too that, one option for increasing the ability of US forces to operate in the region is to rely more on some of our other allies and partners in the region. And of course, this has been a real challenge the last few years, but I think one of the top priorities for the Indo-Pacific Command has to be working with the Philippines in particular to make sure that these smaller Marine Corps units can be distributed across the region, not just in Japan, right? And the more we can do that, the more that we can relieve some of the pressure on Japan to play that role. And this is where Japan has actually done critical work, right? Working with the Philippines on security issues, working with some of the Pacific Islands on security issues. So the more that the US can be present elsewhere in the region, the less pressure that puts on us to have these large formations in Japan itself.
It's interesting when Secretary of Defense Perry, I think, when Joe was the secretary, first committed to getting the U.S. out of Futema 25 years ago, the context was extremely different. We were really, I think, talking about two parallel military structures and operations at the time. And what you're hearing from the panel right now is a completely different context. I mean, Sheila points to the geopolitical and geographic centrality of Okinawa in the first island chain, which is at the center of the contest right now for supremacy in Asia. The Marine Corps' mission now is amphibious, but it's also littoral. And that's also the mission of the Japan Self-Defense Forces. I mean, today the Ground Self-Defense Forces are working on 2 Marine Corps type regiments. That was not in the mix in 1995. And so are the Australians and the Canadians and the Koreans and the Kiwis. So it's also a mission set that integrates maritime democracy. So it's a completely different context. I personally think that Futema replacement facility will be built. It may not look like what we expected, but because Suga is committed to doing it. But that shouldn't be what defines this whole discussion, I think, is what you're hearing from the panel. There's a larger context about distributing our presence, jointness, amphibious and littoral capabilities with allies and partners. And one of the critical things for this alliance is to get that bigger strategic and operational context back in place. But that's hard because it's so political, as Sheila knows better than anyone, because she spent a lot of time bicycling around Okinawa. I have a lot of questions about the Biden administration, almost all from Japanese journalists, some from Americans, asking whether Japan should be worried that a Biden administration might get a little soft on China. And I'm sure all of you have gotten these questions before. And I'm not going to ask the Democrats on the panel to start. I'm going to ask the out-of-work Republicans to start. And Rich, maybe you can start, but should Japan be worried about a Biden administration?
I think if you look at the initial comments of those who are nominated for posts in the Biden administration, you'll see some very heartening comments about Asia and the importance of Asia first. Second of all, I do not believe that the Biden administration is going to be soft on China. Some of the people who are being mentioned for assistant secretary jobs, both in the Pentagon and the State Department, are among the hardest liners on China. And third of all, you were mentioning how Mike, the context of Okinawa 25, 26 years ago was different then than it is now. Well, so too is the US Congress different now than it was then. If the Biden administration had a desire to be soft on China, which I don't believe they had, the attitude on Capitol Hill, both in the Democrats and Republicans, has shifted remarkably on China. And there's not much of a pro-China lobby left in Washington. So the short answer is no. I don't think there's anything to be worried about.
Yeah, for better or worse, some of our friends on the Hill, like Dan Sullivan and Marco Rubio, are just waiting with a baseball bat for even a little quiver in the knee to keep them honest, although we probably don't have to worry about it. Kara?
I just wanted to echo Ambassador Armitage's thoughts. Yes, the answer is no, but also you've seen some of the statements about their reluctance to move on sanctions anytime soon, or to remove ourselves from the phase 1 agreement. So I think they've been quite vocal actually in terms of how they're going to approach this relationship, at least initially.
Sorry, I was on mute. Bob? Bob, you're still on mute too.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Mike. I think the Rich's point is important. Everyone in Washington understands the old assumptions about China have been proven wrong, and there's pretty much a consensus that China is a strategic competitor. And the problem, and I think what the Biden people, if you look at the writings of some of the Kurt Campbell and others who are probably going to be in that administration, they want, the policy is really now not developed. The Trump people never define what the terms of strategic competition are, what the limits, where are the areas of cooperation. So I think the way the Biden people want to approach it is how do we manage the competition? How do we create a framework for some kind of competitive coexistence? And that how that plays out is up to China, but I don't think it's a question of hard or soft. I think it's a question of smart or dumb.
We're all in favor of smart power. Look, we'll see. There's still appointments to be made. There's still hard decisions pending, but the early signs, as Rich said, are pretty promising. And on the US-Japan alliance, I think it really reflects what has happened since the first Armitage and I report. This is a bipartisan alliance, probably the most bipartisan alliance in American history, certainly recent history. Joe?
I agree with what Rich said and others have said. I know these people that are designated by Biden. What you're going to see is a more predictable and less idiosyncratic approach to China, but you're not going to see something that Japanese have often worried about, that we'll trade Japan for China. I'll make a bet. I don't know whether it's going to be in yen or dollars, but not in yuan, that you'll see at the end of the Biden administration, whenever that is, a much stronger US-Japan alliance than you see today. And that's within the context that the alliance today is a lot stronger than when Rich and I first started working on it together.
Jeffrey Hornan from RAND asked a question about moving from 5 eyes to 6 eyes. It's one of the features in this report and a previous Armitage and I report. And he asks, what do we think about the obstacles to this, including in Japan, where, there are real challenges with political oversight and so forth. I don't know, Rich, you want to get us started on 5 eyes to 6 eyes?
Yes, I do, Mike. First of all, the difficulties of moving to 6 eyes, I think, are almost entirely in Japan. To come up with a process in which you can appropriately share intel with a very limited number of Diet members. We have our own system, and Japan will have to come up with theirs. I think in terms of the US and other partners, the whole tenor of allowing a 6th eye has changed. I think as a general matter, there's a realization that the difficulties and problems of the world, whether they're security, economic, technological, bear greater information sharing, not lesser. So I think the administration and the other 4 eyes are much more inclined to this than we might credit. We haven't had, to my knowledge, an in-depth discussion. I've had, along with some others, one-off discussions with other allies, but I think the real problem still is as it was, in the ability of Japan to appropriately share this information with Diet members without getting it out into the press, et cetera.
And Rich, how do you think about this happening? Because we didn't detail it in the report. Is it a kind of a la carte, step-by-step? For example, Japan brings a lot of capability in overhead imagery. How does this look if we actually do it? We didn't specify in the report.
Well, I think in the United States, Mike, we do have a pretty good intel sharing bilaterally with Japan, and Japan has, with their great network of trading companies, et cetera, a ready-made outpost in various and far-flung locations around the world. So there's a lot of information that Japan gets and does share with the United States. So I think, first of all, we in the United States would have to have an understanding of just how Japan intends to protect the equities of the Five Eyes partners. And second of all, I think the United States would have to take a lead in socializing this more systematically with our Five Eyes partners.
Anyone else want to comment on 5 eyes, 6 eyes? Good. It strikes me as a what did Deng Xiaoping say? Cross the river by filling the stones one at a time. Imagery, missile defense, ASW, intel cells, one step at a time. Japan's done a lot under Prime Minister Abe to strengthen the protection of secrecy, but it was controversial. The public opinion polls, the newspaper editorials didn't say red light, but yellow light on these things because of Japan's history, and moving in the right direction, but probably this is not a overnight thing. It's one step at a time. But Japan brings real capabilities, especially I think in imagery, with real coverage that we don't have, both in terms of the time difference and geography and some technology. I had a really interesting question from someone named Chris McRae about how a younger generation in the US-Japan should be thinking about the alliance. When we did our CSIS survey on China policy, support for defending Japan was very high. We asked on a scale of 1 to 10, how much risk should the US take to defend Japan? And, for thought leaders in society, it was almost 9. For the public, it was almost 8. But the big drop came with people aged 18 to 30. And we, when we analyzed the results, we thought, is this because that demographic has seen wars in Iraq and Afghanistan for as long as they can remember, tends to think that conflict is our fault? Is it because they care about other issues more, climate change, for example, or racial justice? So a couple of us are professors, all of us have staff, and all of us are mentoring next generation. I don't know who wants to start, maybe Joe, because you were a dean. Yeah, what do you think about the next generation in the US and Japan about this alliance, and what do the rest of us who care about it have to do to keep this consensus and momentum going?
Well, Chris McRae always asks difficult questions, but he's right. One of the interesting points is that if you look back at Japanese students in American universities 20 years ago or 30 years ago, much higher than it is now. In that sense, for internal reasons, many Japanese students have decided to stay at home rather than go to the United States. And that means you have fewer contacts at that level. The various departments, Gaimusho and others, still send Japanese mid-careers or young career types to Harvard to take, just to cite the experience that I'm familiar with. But that's not quite the same as the kids who come basically as undergraduates, and that's gone down. And similarly, I think the programs in which Japan would recruit young Americans to go and teach English or to live in Japan, the JET program and others, were extremely important. My daughter-in-law and son participated in just recent college graduates in similar type programs. So I think this idea of how do you get the younger generation to have those informal personal contacts that knit countries together is a very important question.
Sheila, I'm going to ask Zack and Sheila, because I know you both teach, Zack at CSIS and Sheila at Georgetown.
Thank you, Mike. No, I think that's right. We have a new generation now that approaches the relationship, I think, through slightly different eyes. And one thing is my other hat as chair of CULCON, the bilateral committee that looks at how to build people-to-people relationships in between the United States and Japan. We did a task force on the next generation. And what was stunning was the breadth of this relationship. In other words, the many, many, many fields that the United States and Japanese next generation folks in particular, that they want to work with their Japanese colleagues on. They don't necessarily want to do what you and I did, Mike and Matt and others. We went, we studied, we got the language under our belts, we became Japan experts. There are a whole host of younger people today who may not have that opportunity or don't even actually need to go to Japan or think they don't necessarily want to spend long amounts of time studying the language, but they seek out Japanese ideas. They seek inspiration from Japan, either in the arts and design, but they also realize that across the board, the way in which the Americans and Japanese work together in space and energy, in fields that we wouldn't have imagined, when we were younger, right? There's so much more opportunity for younger people now to engage in the partnership. So I think that's an important way to understand, is it not necessarily replicas of all of us here on the screen, but that there's a diversity of opportunity, and we need to find ways to mentor and make sure that those opportunities are available to the next generation.
Zack? You're both a professor and closest to that generation of any of us.
I mean, I think one of the challenges that we're seeing right now, right, is that a lot of Americans aren't supportive of immigration, which I think is just a huge mistake. And this is where I think it's absolutely critical, right? When it's harder for Japanese to come here and learn about the United States, some of these ties can evaporate. You know, when we're not letting H-1Bs in, right? When immigration numbers are really low. And obviously Japan has its own lessons to learn on immigration itself. And so I think this is one place that we just have to be dedicated about making sure that we're making those ties across the Pacific. And look, we're going to be in a new world after COVID, right? Universities are under more pressure than ever, and big universities, right? I mean, I teach at Princeton, big endowment, still serious problems with funding for overseas programs. And I think we have to make sure that those keep getting funded. And one place in Asia that we're going to see a shift, I think, is that it is harder and harder to get students to go to China. If you look at a lot of the overseas programs in China, they're not very popular with students. So I went to Stanford for undergrad. I went to the Stanford and Beijing Center. There's no one there a few years ago. The students just aren't that interested. I think this is an opportunity for Japan to say, hey, if you want to go to Asia, spend some time in the region, come to Japan, right? And there's nothing to make up for those lost people-to-people ties. So I think this is both a real opportunity for the alliance, but an area where, as you noted, Mike, there's a bit of danger here of backsliding and getting away from these people-to-people relationships.
So I had an article about Article 2. Somebody's following Matt Goodman's work. Article 2 of the 1960 Security Treaty is about economics. And the question is basically, are we not really primed now for a kind of renaissance, a real, ambitious agenda for economic integration, economic cooperation? Japan is now the largest investor in the US, for example. We did recommend TPP, which is pretty ambitious, but that's sort of a lateral to Matt to say a bit more about what we should be thinking about for the economic relationship.
The short answer is yes, absolutely. I really feel that when I started with, Mike and I back in the 80s working on Japan, even though he was focused on the security side, it was, infected by the trade tensions that we had that were really the dominant force, arguably in the whole relationship. But certainly, the economic side was dominated by those issues. I mean, those issues, except for this brief, slightly hard to explain blip during the Trump administration of going after, steel and autos on sort of specious national security grounds, trade friction has not been a part of the U.S.-Japan relationship. It's just been transformed our relationship. And now it's all about how, as Rich Armitage said, we're looking through the front mirror of windscreen of the car, and there's just huge challenge and opportunity for the U.S. and Japan to work together. There's a lot of areas in which the rules of the road or standards or norms in economics, as in other things, are either not there or under stress and under challenge. And I think the U.S. and Japan are pretty much, we have our own interests that vary 5 degrees, 10 degrees here and there, but in general, we're almost entirely aligned on those issues. So when it comes to digital governance, for example, there's a huge opportunity for us to work in the Asia Pacific region through our work in APEC and through TPP and extending that to other agreements. So I think this really is going to be if not the organizing principle of U.S.-Japan cooperation going forward. Just a huge array of opportunities here, and certainly no shortage of challenges. If I could just add 30 seconds, 2 seconds, just to say, I'm optimistic on the young people question. I mean, there's just such a strong demand here among younger people for an understanding, maybe not for the formal programs and things, but just a natural interest in Japanese culture and Japan as a fascinating player in the ways that I was just discussing, we've all been discussing. I feel there's a new opportunity for youth engagement in the alliance that's going to be very positive.
Yeah, whenever I start to wonder a little bit about the next generation's engagement in Japan, inevitably every year at Georgetown, new freshman walks into my office and introduces themselves in Japanese, in fluent Japanese, and says American, and says they want to study Japan. And I said, did you grow up in Japan? Were your parents in the service or business? And the answer almost always is, no, I love anime. And I taught myself Japanese when I was in junior high school so I could watch anime in Japanese. That's soft power, Dr. Nye. That's real soft power. So I have a question from Jim Auer, who is one of the most important architects of this alliance in the Navy, the Pentagon, and at Vanderbilt, which is basically what more can the alliance do to make the Taiwan Strait stable and Taiwan secure? And actually, there were a couple of questions. Admiral Mike McDevitt weighed in with an idea. Scott Harold asked, I'm going to hopefully not garble Mike McDevitt's idea, which is Japan does not have a Taiwan Relations Act, does not have any explicit commitment to security in the Taiwan Strait beyond its own defense. But what if Japan had a statement that an attack on US forces based in Japan, even if they're in the Taiwan Strait, is considered an attack on Japan? It's kind of an intriguing idea just to put out there. But in general, starting with Rich, what more, we touch on Taiwan, but what more should we be doing? Still on mute, Rich.
Mike, first of all, we have overlooked something in our excitement about having this presentation today, and that was the fact that we have dedicated this fifth Armitage and I report to our mutual friend, late friend, Yukio Okamoto, and of course his wife, Kyoko. If there was anyone who embodied the spirit of the U.S.-Japan relationship better than Yukio Okamoto, I don't know who it was. So let me, a little belatedly here, note our affection and our loss of Yukio, and note the fact that we stand in full sympathy and full of prayers for Kyoko. On the question of Taiwan, we mentioned it in our report as being part of the first island chain, and therefore to Japan and to us of vital importance. We do and have seen increased sort of political discussion in Japan about Taiwan. I think there's a growing awareness. I think many in Japan wish they'd done more like the United States did in 1979 and had a Taiwan Relations Act. So I would be very much in favor of increasing exchanges, et cetera, between Japan and Taiwan. I understand the difficulties. I understand a lot about Taiwan, but I appreciate Jim Auer's question, Scott Harold's question, and I very much appreciate the ideas that Mike McDevitt and others are putting forward to find ways to increase the importance to us and to Japan of Taiwan, and find ways in which we make clear to everyone that the 23.5 million people on the island of Taiwan deserve to live in peace and freedom, prosperity, and democracy.
The questions were really excellent. We're not going to be able to get to them all because we're at the end of our time. We had questions about North Korea, about Russia, about the Middle East. Really shows the geographic breadth of this alliance. There was a question about Japan's role in supporting democratic norms, which I think is an incredibly important aspect of our alliance now. Japan is now a major spender on assistance for governance and democracy. It does it differently from the US or Canada or Britain, but it's becoming an important part of Japan's diplomacy. And in public opinion polls now, including the one we did at CSIS, Japanese citizens are the most likely to agree to putting pressure on China to support Taiwan's autonomy, to support Hong Kong's autonomy and democracy. I think the situation in Hong Kong really speaks to Japanese citizens in a special way. So there are a lot of things that we didn't get to. I'm going to give our co-chairs, Joe Nye and then Rich Armitage, the last word before we wrap up. But thank you to the panel. Thank you for the excellent questions. And the final word to you, Joe and Rich. Unmuting. Yeah, thanks.
I would say that very briefly that this has been a good discussion, but it's also been, I think, an important report. And my takeaway for others who've listened to this, or maybe some who didn't get a chance to ask a question, is to focus on that title, An Equal Alliance with a Global Agenda. And that's really something that we need to spend much more attention to. It's going to be key to the next 4 years, and we can all pitch in on it. Let me hand it back to Rich.
I think for people like Dr. Nye and myself, particularly, we are in a way going out the back door of our careers. We've had a long career, mostly centered on U.S.-Japan, and I'm very proud of it. I know Joe's very proud of it. And that has forced us, because of our affection for Japan, to be very involved in all of Asia and beyond. I'm one of those who is optimistic about the future of the young seed corn in Japan. When Joe and I used to do a dog and pony show in Tokyo, we'd go speak at different places and have a few people or a few dozen people or 100 people who would want to come hear us. Now, when Joe and I go and we speak about security and U.S.-Japan relationship, very often it's an overflow crowd. I know that's your experience, Joe, and it's also mine, which indicates to me there's fertile ground in Japan for even greater affection for the U.S.-Japan relationship. And in the time God gives me left to push these issues, I'm going to continue full speed ahead. And I thank you, Mike, for your agreeing to host this today.
Rich and Joe, thank you for sharing the fifth of these reports, for your leadership, and really for your bipartisanship, which has been so crucial to this alliance. And Zack and Kara, Bob, Matt, and Sheila, thank you. I don't know if this is the last Armitage and I report. It's certainly not the last word on the U.S.-Japan alliance. The questions were excellent. I think everybody on the panel is pleased that this is generating as much discussion as it is answering hard problems, which is exactly what we would hope for. So to the audience, thank you. And to everyone on the panel, thank you, and have a great holiday season.